In mid-October 2025, a $10 billion headline shocked the global tech industry. The Netherlands government had just frozen the assets of Nexperia. Nexperia, a major semiconductor company owned entirely by Chinese capital. The media narrative formed instantly. This was framed as another major battle in the high-stakes US-China chip war. Headlines connected it to ASML, the Dutch giant that makes advanced lithography machines. They talked about 5-nanometer chips, about artificial intelligence, about America's push to block China from cutting-edge technology. The myth was simple. The West had scored another victory containing China's relentless technological advance. But what if I told you that narrative is a complete misdirection? What if this $10 billion seizure has almost nothing to do with AI chips? What if it has nothing to do with 5-nanometer technology? The real story here is about a different war, a quieter, less glamorous, but arguably far more critical conflict. This is the war for the boring chips, the ones that don't make the headlines but absolutely run your world, specifically the chips that run your car. Today we're going to decode the real strategy behind this $10 billion Nexperia drama. This isn't a story about the West stopping China in its tracks. This is the story of how China strategically outmaneuvered the West 5 years ago, and how the recent Dutch action is not a show of strength, but a desperate, panicked reaction. Far too late. Welcome to the hidden front line of the semiconductor war, the overlooked battlefield, the legacy chip loophole. To understand the Nexperia situation, you must first understand a critical distinction. There are really two semiconductor wars happening right now. War number one is the one you read about constantly. This is the battle for advanced nodes. These are the cutting-edge chips built on tiny processes. 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer. Think of these as the brains. They power high-performance computing, artificial intelligence like NVIDIA's H100 GPUs, and the latest smartphones. This is where the United States has focused almost all its firepower. U.S. sanctions have relentlessly targeted China's access to this high end. They pressured the Netherlands to block ASML from selling its most advanced EUV lithography machines to China. They restricted NVIDIA and AMD from exporting top-tier AI chips. Washington's strategy was clear. Stop China from reaching the technological peak. But while everyone was watching the peak, they missed the mountain. War number two is the battle for mature nodes, also called legacy chips. These are built on older, larger, but incredibly reliable processes. 40 nanometer, 90 nanometer, even 130 nanometer. If advanced chips are the brains, these mature chips are the nervous system of our modern economy. They aren't flashy. They are workhorses. They include crucial components like Power Management Integrated Circuits, or PMICs, basic logic components. And critically for our story today, MOSFETs, metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistors. These are essential power switching devices and ESD protection diodes, which shield sensitive electronics from static discharge. Why do these boring chips matter so much? Because they are everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And nowhere are they more critical than in the automotive industry. A modern electric vehicle is a computer on wheels. And while it has some advanced processing chips, it relies on thousands of these mature node components. Estimates vary, but a typical EV might contain up to 2,000 legacy chips. A Tesla Model 3, for instance, uses far more silicon built on 90 nanometer processes than on cutting-edge 7 nanometer ones. These legacy chips manage the battery charging and discharging. They control the power windows, the dashboard displays, the braking system, ABS, the airbags. Without a reliable supply of these high-quality, automotive-certified legacy chips, you simply cannot build a modern car. Production lines stop instantly. This brings us to the strategic blunder. The U.S. sanctions, laser-focused on the 3mm and 5mm brains, largely ignored the 40 nanometer to 130 nanometer nervous system. Perhaps they assumed these older technologies weren't strategically important. Perhaps they believed Western companies like Europe's Infineon and ST Microelectronics, or America's Texas Instruments, would always dominate this market. Whatever the reason, this oversight created a massive strategic loophole, a blind spot in the West containment strategy, and it was a loophole that China identified and exploited years before Washington even realized it existed. In fact, the U.S. government only started to wake up to this problem very recently. As confirmed by White House documents and U.S. Trade Representative reports from late 2024 and early 2025, Washington launched investigations into China's targeting of these foundational or legacy chip sectors. They finally realized China was aiming to dominate not just the future of AI, but the present reality of cars, factories, and power grids. The investigations were launched, but by then, China's key strategic move had already been made 5 years earlier. The $10 billion crown jewel, China's masterstroke. Let's rewind the clock to 2018. The world was focused on Huawei, 5G, and the escalating U.S.-China trade war. But behind the headlines, a different, quieter acquisition was underway. A Chinese company called Wintec Technology set its sights on a newly independent Dutch firm, Nexperia. Nexperia, remember, was the legacy standard products division spun off from the European giant Philips Semiconductors. It wasn't an AI startup. It wasn't developing 3-nanometer chips. It was a master of the boring, mature node technologies. The acquisition wasn't a sudden hostile takeover. It was a gradual, multi-year process. According to financial records from PitchBook and Reuters, Wintec started in 2018 acquiring an initial stake for roughly 25.2 billion Chinese yuan, or about 3.63 billion US dollars at the time. Over the next 2 years, they steadily increased their ownership. By 2020, Wintec had achieved 100% control, having invested billions more. The original transcript mentioned a total figure over 33 billion yuan, roughly $5 billion total over the period. This was, at the time, the largest ever cross-border acquisition in China's semiconductor history, and it happened largely under the radar, completed legally under European regulations before the West began viewing these legacy chips as a national security issue. Why did Wintec pay billions for a company specializing in old technology? Because Nexperia wasn't just a player in mature nodes. It was the crown jewel. Nexperia inherited 60 years of Philips's manufacturing expertise and intellectual property. Fact-checking confirms Nexperia's own claims and market reports. It is the undisputed world leader in ESD protection chips specifically designed for the demanding automotive market. It ranks among the global top 3 suppliers for essential power discrete components and basic logic chips used in cars. Crucially, Nexperia held the rigorous automotive-grade certifications, like AEC Q100 and Q101. These certifications represent incredibly high barriers to entry. They demand years of testing for reliability under extreme temperatures and vibrations. Chinese domestic chip makers were decades behind in achieving this level of trust from global automakers. Wintec didn't just buy factories. They bought 60 years of European engineering credibility, instantly. This connects directly to the Achilles heel of the electric vehicle revolution. China understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the transition to EVs wasn't just about battery technology or software. It was fundamentally dependent on a massive, reliable supply of these certified, automotive-grade power and logic chips, the very chips Nexperia specialized in. As the original transcript correctly stated, and other sources like CarWow confirm, a modern EV needs thousands of chips of this type. The estimate of around 1,000 Nexperia chips per vehicle, used by giants like Tesla, Volkswagen, and China's own BYD, highlights their market dominance. By acquiring Nexperia in 2020, China executed a strategic masterstroke. They didn't just buy a company, they secured control over a critical choke point in the global automotive supply chain. They gained leverage over their Western competitors who relied on Nexperia's components. And they did it years before U.S. sanctions even began to target this sector. China's EV dominance strategy, checkmate. Let's zoom out to the bigger picture. China's national ambition, clearly stated in policies like Made in China 2025, is global leadership in key future industries, and perhaps no industry is more central to that ambition than electric vehicles. China is already the world's largest EV market and producer. Companies like BYD are now outselling Tesla globally in pure battery electric vehicles. But to sustain this dominance, Beijing knew it needed a fortified supply chain. They could not remain dependent on Western suppliers like Europe's Infineon or Microelectronics for the fundamental building blocks of their EVs. The Nexperia acquisition was the linchpin of this fortification strategy. It instantly gave China several key advantages. First, access to proven, reliable, automotive-certified, mature node technology, leapfrogging decades of development. Second, a global manufacturing footprint, including key factories in Europe, like the one in Hamburg, Germany, and established relationships with Western automakers. Third, a massive revenue stream and insight into competitors' supply chains as Nexperia continued supplying chips to Tesla, Volkswagen, Apple, and others. And this strategy paid off handsomely for Wintech. The fact check confirms the numbers from the original transcript and other industry reports. Under Chinese management, Nexperia's performance soared. By its fiscal year 2022, annual revenue hit $2.36 billion euros. Its gross profit margin jumped from around 25% pre-acquisition to an impressive 42.4%. Nexperia became a highly profitable, strategically invaluable asset. And here is the most brilliant part of the strategy. All of this success, this strategic consolidation of the automotive chip supply chain, happened outside the scope of U.S. sanctions. While Washington was obsessed with blocking 5-nanometer EUV machines and high-end NVIDIA AI chips, China was quietly locking down the supply of the 40-nanometer workhorse chips needed for the trillion-dollar global auto industry. They were playing chess while the U.S. was playing checkers, focused on the wrong pieces. This brings us back to the Netherlands' action in October 2025. By this point, the West had finally woken up. The U.S. government investigations into China's targeting of legacy chips, launched late 2024, early 2025, signaled this shift. They realized the strategic danger of allowing China to control Nexperia. They understood it gave Beijing immense leverage over Western automakers. So the Dutch government's move to seize control of Nexperia wasn't proactive. It wasn't a clever strategic play. It was a panic move, a desperate, belated attempt to undo a strategic blunder made years earlier. And what happened immediately after the Dutch seizure? China demonstrated the very leverage the West now feared. According to reports from outlets like Modern Diplomacy, Beijing responded almost immediately. China reportedly banned the export of finished chips from Nexperia's facilities under its control. This action instantly threatened the production lines of German automakers like Volkswagen, who relied on those chips. The Dutch attempt to regain control had backfired. It merely triggered China to weaponize the supply chain choke point it had already secured 5 years prior. It proved that the Netherlands and the West were reacting, not leading. Conclusion and resonance loop. So, what does the Nexperia saga truly tell us? The Dutch government's seizure in October 2025 was fundamentally too little, too late. It was like trying to lock the stable door 5 years after the horse bolted. Yes, it freezes a $10 billion asset on paper. Yes, it causes financial complications for Wintech technology. But the real strategic damage was already done. Between 2020 and 2025, under full Chinese ownership, Nexperia operated without restriction. During those 5 critical years, China had unfettered access. Access to Nexperia's mature node process technology, access to its manufacturing know-how, built over 60 years by Philips, access to its global customer list and supply chain intelligence. You can be certain that significant knowledge transfer occurred during that period. China's domestic chip makers, like SMEC or Huahong, undoubtedly learned immense amounts from Nexperia's operations. Seizing the company now cannot claw back that transferred knowledge. It cannot undo the strategic advantage China gained in understanding and penetrating the critical automotive semiconductor market. The Dutch action might inflict financial pain, but it doesn't reverse the strategic reality. The West simply failed to recognize the battlefield. They were so focused on the glamorous high-end chip war, the race for AI supremacy, that they ignored the foundational, high-volume legacy chips that actually keep our industries running. China saw this blind spot. They acted decisively 5 years ago. And the panicked reaction we see today from the Netherlands is an admission of that strategic failure. The West may win battles in the high-end chip war, but in the critical war for the automotive chips that define the EV revolution, the evidence suggests they may have already lost, years ago, without even realizing they were fighting. This move to secure the automotive supply chain is perhaps China's most brilliant strategic play of the last decade, and it's part of a much larger, unnoticed conflict. We'll explore that in our next video on how the US completely lost the boring chip war, the war for the chips that actually run our world. This leaves us with a crucial question for the future. As the West focuses all its efforts on stopping China's high-end AI chips, do you think they've already lost the much larger, more practical war for the legacy chips that run our cars, factories, and entire industries? Let me know your strategy in the comments below.